Thank you.
Mr Speaker.
I call the Honourable Member Holly Walker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm pleased to take a call at the final stages of the Student Loan Scheme Amendment Bill to once again reiterate the reasons for the Green Party's opposition to this bill. And I'm proud to note, in fact, that the Green Party is the only party who's consistently opposed this bill through all its stages. As I've said in the debates on earlier stages, there are some parts of this bill that we can live with, including losses from the calculation of income for student loan repayment purposes being excluded, and including allowing IRD to ask for details of a contact person in New Zealand for overseas borrowers. We're comfortable with those provisions in the bill. Mr Speaker, what we can't support is the reduction of the repayment holiday from 3 years to 1. And we consider this to be a policy that's been made in a vacuum for ideological reasons, in a vacuum of evidence, and which may actually see borrowers staying overseas and not returning to New Zealand and taking longer to repay their loans, which is contrary to the intent of this legislation. We've heard from the Select Committee stages and in other stages of debate on this bill that if it saves any money at all, which is a guess, it will be a mere drop in the bucket of $5 to $6 million in terms of what's recollected from those on a repayment holiday, in the context of a total student debt of more than $12 billion. And even that, as we have heard, is guesswork. So, Mr Speaker, we simply can't support this poor decision-making, this poor policy. Now, to look at the repayment holiday and why we have it and why it's important to keep it at 3 years, I want to reiterate the current situation. So, if a student loan borrower stays in New Zealand, they are not charged interest on their student loan, and therefore they've got an incentive to stay and work in New Zealand and contribute to New Zealand, and we totally support that. Their student loans are repaid automatically via their tax code. Now, if they're travelling or living overseas on their OE, they are charged interest, but they can take a break from their repayment obligations for up to 3 years, and that is the repayment holiday that we're debating tonight. Mr Speaker, we believe it makes sense for that repayment holiday to be set at 3 years for a number of reasons. The first of which we've just heard from the previous speaker is that we know from research that it takes about 12 to 18 months for New Zealanders living overseas to set up in the new place where they're living and get established in a job and a career. So constricting it to 1 year is will very much constrain the time that those overseas borrowers have before they've actually even started work, that they may have to start making repayments on their loan. We also know from research by the Kiwi Expats Association, or KIA, that the average New Zealander is away on their overseas experience, their OE, for 3 to 5 years. So it seems entirely consistent with that 3-year average for the repayment holiday on the loan to be 3 years. And furthermore, Mr Speaker, we know, and it's a contribution that's been made a number of times in this House by the Honourable Nanaia Mahuta, that in a number of the countries where it's common for New Zealanders to go on their overseas experiences, we have working holiday visas, which are set typically at about 2 years. So again, it makes sense to be consistent with the provisions that govern people's behaviour while they're living overseas, that this should be at least aligned with the provisions of working holiday visas. It's also important to have a repayment holiday because, as we've heard and as we've seen at the Select Committee and has been discussed in previous stages, the defaults and arrears and late payment fees and interests that is charged on the loans of overseas borrowers can escalate to the point where their loan balance has become 2 to 3 times the original principal that they took out on their student loan. And that gives people a very real disincentive if they're living overseas and they're straddled with a student debt that is now ballooned out to 2 to 3 times what they originally borrowed. It's a very real disincentive not to return to New Zealand and repay that loan. And if they don't return to New Zealand, that's bad. It's bad for the country because the debt doesn't get repaid, and it's also bad for the country because we don't get our graduates back who we so urgently need, and so many of whom we know are moving overseas and staying there for a long time. So all of these things I've just outlined are the reasons that were given by the very same minister who's sponsoring this legislation for introducing the 3-year repayment holiday in the first place back in 2007. And I've posed the question a number of times, which has still not been answered, of what has changed since 2007 that make those reasons any less valid than they were then. And actually, I would say that, in fact, nothing has changed except the fact that even more graduates are going overseas and never coming back, which would make those reasons even more valid than they were. There's also barely been enough time since the introduction of the 3-year repayment holiday for any research to be done to assess the impact that it has on borrowers' behaviour. And we can see from the Select Committee report that this is acknowledged. It was acknowledged in the hearing of evidence at the Select Committee that there has not been enough empirical evidence and very limited modelling of the impact of the 3-year repayment holiday on borrowers' behaviour. So before we even know what impact we're having, we're legislating to change it. And it just seems like bad lawmaking to me, Mr Speaker, to do so in such a vacuum of evidence. In fact, it's not an entire vacuum of evidence, though, because the evidence we do have from the Ministry of Education and from Treasury is that actually it might discourage borrowers from returning to New Zealand. Because of the reasons mentioned, the way that late payments and arrears build up for overseas borrowers can actually create a real disincentive for them to return to New Zealand. And the Ministry of Education said it could have a real impact at the margins on borrowers' behaviour in terms of how quickly they repay their loans and how soon they return to New Zealand. And all of this, as I mentioned, is in the context of more New Zealanders moving overseas than ever before. So it seems to the Green Party, Mr Speaker, that this change makes absolutely no sense and is supported by no evidence. That's why I moved an amendment in the committee stages. It was not ruled out of order. It was voted down, unfortunately. But I moved an amendment to keep the repayment holiday at 3 years because of the lack of evidence that's been provided for any reason for the change and the very real concerns that, in fact, it will make things worse. I was pleased to see that Labor moved similar amendments, and indeed very pleased to see that Labor has changed their stance on this bill to oppose it after the Select Committee stages because, as they have argued, their concerns about the repayment holiday is significant as well. Mr Speaker, I want to briefly address the issue of retrospectivity, which I think is quite concerning in relation to this bill. So, as someone who's been following these changes closely, you can probably imagine my surprise knowing that I was due to debate the third reading of this bill in the House this week. To open the Dominion Post yesterday and read on page 5 that the changes that this bill makes have already come into effect, quoting an official from the RRD and you wouldn't believe it if you had any faith in parliamentary democracy.
Order. When the member uses the word you bring the Speaker into the debate.
Mr Speaker, you would not believe it if you had any faith in parliamentary democracy either. That a bill that has not yet passed is being reported in the media as having come into effect when it hasn't passed. Now, I know that the Minister moved an amendment during the committee stages to make parts of the bill retrospective, those parts that weren't already retrospective, in fact, Mr Speaker. And I queried that at the time, but what I would like to put on record is that surely even a retrospective clause can't be deemed to have come into effect until after the legislation has passed. And I think we deserve an answer from the Minister or his officials about why IRD officials were quoted in the newspaper yesterday as saying that the changes had come into effect when the bill hasn't finished going through Parliament. I see that as a serious abuse of process. And as one commentator called it, it's legislation by press release, Mr Speaker, and it's disrespectful of this House and its processes, and I think the Minister owes the House an explanation about that. So what we've seen in this bill is a shoddy process, a rushed process, a vacuum of evidence, a poor decision, unsupported by evidence, and even if it has the effect that they think it might, at the very, very best guess, it might save $5 to $6 million a year in the context of a $12 billion student debt. It's shoddy lawmaking, Mr Speaker, a shoddy policy and a shoddy process. And all that I can explain it, all that I can think of to explain it is that this is consistent with the Prime Minister's design to want to rein in student loans in a big way, based not on what's best for students, but on any way to clamp down on access to student loans without touching interest-free student loans, because he's scared to go there politically. We've already heard about this freeze on parental income threshold for the student allowance. That doesn't bode well, and nor does this bill, Mr Speaker, and I shudder to think what changes we're about to see in the student loans and allowance space in the coming months.
Mr Speaker.
Just before I call the next member, can I just advise members that every time a member uses the expression you, the member is referring to the chair. Okay? And the member must refer to the minister or to another member as the minister or that member. That is in the third person. And I'd suggest that members have a look at Standing Order 104. You cannot bring the Speaker to the debate. I call the honourable member